Do you think you know the secrets of ancient Rome? Think again. The tales of brave gladiators and imperial glory are a lie. We're about to scrape away the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum to unearth the single most appalling practice the Roman Senate desperately tried to erase from every historical record. This story isn't about the fight itself. It's about the horrific, forgotten truth of what happened when the arena gates slammed shut and the last of the 50,000 spectators went home, leaving a champion gladiator alone with his terrible prize. In 79 AD, just beneath the world's largest theater of death, a 19-year-old Dacian woman named Livia stood trembling. Hours earlier, she'd heard the deafening roar as the gladiator, Gaius Valerius Maximus, severed the life from her kinsman. What transpired next, in the 3 hours following that final kill, was a systematic act of psychological warfare so depraved, historians like Cassius Dio wrestled with documenting it. This is the truth of the Victoria Carnalis, the carnal victory, and the dark, hidden meaning of the spoils of war. Before we descend into that horrific labyrinth, do us a favor. Hit that like button if you think history shouldn't hide its ugliest moments. And make sure to subscribe because this story will forever change how you view ancient Rome. Finally, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far the reach of this ancient empire extends today. Across the vast landscape of the 1st century AD, the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum, was not merely a venue. It was a monument to Rome's absolute dominion, a terrifying altar where political ambition, religious rites, and brutal social control converged. Completed just a year prior in 80 AD, its immense stone structure could hold a small army of spectators, and its atmosphere was permanently stained with the metallic stench of fresh blood, bile, and human fear, masked only slightly by incense. The arena floor, covered in thick sand, was a sponge for the horrific effusion of men and beasts. But the real horror lay beneath the surface. A vast, claustrophobic complex of tunnels, hydraulic lifts, and holding cells, the hypogeum, served as the empire's grisly warehouse for its most unfortunate commodities. Slaves, foreign animals, the condemned, and the conquered elite. The games were never just entertainment. They were meticulously crafted political theater. When General Marcus Antonius returned from decisively crushing the Dacian uprising in 78 AD, his cargo wasn't just bullion and maps. It was 847 human beings, including 124 women from the highest tribal ranks, daughters of kings, wives of chieftains, and sacred priestesses. Rome understood that to truly end a rebellion, you didn't just seize territory. You had to annihilate the spirit of the enemy, turning their most revered symbols into objects of public degradation. Meet Gaius Valerius Maximus. At 32, the 6-foot-tall gladiator was a titan, his physique a testament to a lifetime spent surviving the kill-or-be-killed environment of the arena. Each scar etched onto his body marked a lethal contest overcome. Born into debt slavery, Gaius had killed 89 opponents in sanctioned combat over 14 years. His ultimate goal was the rudis, the small wooden sword that signified his manumission, his freedom. His greatest fear? Dying anonymously, simply another piece of debris to be dragged out with a meat hook. On this fateful afternoon in August 79 AD, Gaius had just achieved his most celebrated victory, defeating the Dacian champion with Emperor Titus watching from the imperial box. The reward for a victory of this magnitude was fixed: 500 gold denarii, a crown of laurel, and, most significantly, first selection among the captivi, the female prisoners of war. Livia, the vanquished, was just 19. With her striking dark hair and fair Highland complexion, she stood out, a painful reminder of her lost status. Only 3 months prior, she watched Roman legionaries execute her betrothed, a respected warrior. Now, she was crammed into a squalid holding cell with 16 other aristocratic women, all stripped of their identities, their families murdered, their future extinguished. Her singular wish was a dignified death. What she feared most was becoming an object of sport for the ecstatic mob that had cheered her people's downfall. A guard had chillingly informed her that morning she was chosen for the afternoon spectacle. She was about to learn that Rome's concept of mercy was often a terrifying synonym for systematic dehumanization. What Rome was attempting to cement was far grander than mere battlefield triumph. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Physical conquest was fleeting. To permanently break a foreign culture, you had to corrupt its core symbols, violate its sacred women, and broadcast the message that even the most protected among the defeated were now toys for the victor. This was not random, petty cruelty. It was a calibrated act of terror, a clear demonstration of absolute powerlessness designed to crush any future thought of resistance. Little did the planners know that this particular event, the ultimate humiliation ritual, would create such a scandal that it would eventually force the Roman Senate itself to intervene and attempt to suppress all evidence. At precisely 3 p.m., as the afternoon shadows stretched long across the gore-soaked sand, the editor spectacularum, master of games, made his descent into the damp, fear-laced corridors of the hypogeum. He approached Gaius Valerius Maximus, whose hands still shook from the adrenaline of his close brush with death. "The divine emperor acknowledges your service," the official formally announced. "By the ancient dictates of the Republic, you are entitled to the full spoils of conquest. Choose your reward." The tablet offered money, high-quality wine, comfortable lodging, or the notorious Victoria Carnalis, the carnal privilege of victory. For a slave who owned nothing but the hope of freedom, this was one of the only moments in his life where he held absolute, uncontested power. Roman society not only permitted this transaction, it celebrated it as the natural and righteous order of conquest. In the women's holding area, a chilling ritual was unfolding. Guards brought buckets of water, not for hydration, but for scrubbing the captives. The women's hair was meticulously untangled, their ragged clothes replaced with simple, clean linen tunics. Livia watched in growing horror as 2 official attendants moved down the line, examining each woman and recording observations on wax tablets. A revered Dacian priestess named Zalmoxis finally whispered the awful truth. "They are making us ready. Ready for the games? Or for the champions after." The preparation wasn't just cosmetic. It was the final, terrifying step in turning human beings into trophies. Meanwhile, back in the stands, 50,000 spectators were settling in for the secondary entertainment, the interludia. These were theatrical interludes staged between the main gladiatorial duels. Mock hunts, historical reenactments, and mythological scenes, which almost always ended with condemned criminals forced to act out the parts of victims, dying in grotesque, staged performances. Today's program had a special designation: the triumph of Rome over barbarian shame. At 3:30, 20 Dacian women, Livia among them, were brought up by the huge, ingenious underground elevator system, emerging directly onto the arena floor through a trapdoor. They stepped into the blinding sun and the violent, suffocating roar of the crowd. The air was a heavy mix of aristocratic perfume, roasting vendor meat, and the hot, coppery smell of dried blood. This would not be a quick, clean execution. Instead, the women were lined up while a herald shouted their alleged crimes: treason, refusal to worship Roman gods, and aiding rebels. Then came the true stroke of psychological genius. They would be offered mercy if they agreed to fight each other in pairs, armed only with wooden training swords, wearing clothing designed to maximize their exposure and public humiliation. You think you know how Roman stories end? Think again. We left 19-year-old Livia standing on the blood-soaked sand, forced into a sadistic spectacle. The rules were simple. The victor would become the sexual spoils of a champion, and the loser would die. This wasn't merely cruelty. It was a calibrated weapon of state designed to demoralize every conquered province. If you are already stunned by the sheer, calculated brutality of this Roman policy, please hit that like button right now. It helps us expose more suppressed histories like this one. The moment the wooden swords were distributed, the air thickened with anticipation. Livia, gripping the rough handle, turned to face her opponent. It wasn't a stranger. It was Camacicus, the sister of her dead fiancé, the woman who had helped weave her wedding shroud, who had sung at her betrothal. Their eyes locked, not in hate, but in shared, crushing despair. The master of games dropped his hand, the signal to fight. But Livia and Camacicus did not move. They stood absolutely still, swords lowered to their sides. The crowd of 50,000, baying for a bloody catfight, shifted instantly. Their cheers turned to confused shouts, then to a violent, frothing anger. "Fight, you cowards!" they roared. The stands began to rain down filth. Chicken bones, olive pits, rotten fruit. Still, the two women stood motionless. This was the most profound form of resistance available to the utterly powerless: refusal. For an agonizing 90 seconds, a terrifying eternity, the most dominant empire on Earth was stalled, defied by two unarmed women choosing not to participate in their own degradation. Then the brutal theater ended. Guards charged. Camacicus was blindsided by the heavy flat of a gladius and collapsed. Livia screamed, rushing to her friend's side, dropping her weapon. The guards dragged them both away, not to the mercy of a quick death, but to something the crowd found equally gratifying: the machinery of institutionalized exploitation. Beneath the deafening roar of the mob, the Colosseum's bureaucracy of horror ground forward with chilling efficiency. Within the hypogeum, a clerk made a cold, official entry: 20 female captives, Dacian origin, processed for post-victory allocation. A second, more damning notation followed: 2 deemed excessively resistant, transferred to private champions' chambers for exclusive use as per tradition. This was the true horror: Rome's perfectly designed system of absolute commodification. Livia and Camacicus were separated. Each was led to a small, isolated stone room, illuminated by flickering torches. These chambers were not improvised dens of abuse. They were clean, functional, and terrifying in their sterile efficiency, purpose-built architectural features just as planned as the cages for the tigers or the lifts for the gladiators. At exactly 4 p.m., Gaius Valerius Maximus entered Livia's chamber. The door swung shut, and silence descended. Gaius was still in his blood-splattered arena gear, the crimson on his chest a mix of his foe's life and his own sweat. Livia was pressed flat against the far wall, defenseless. Between them stood the entire edifice of Roman law. He held every right. She held none. She was a trophy, a prize, a piece of earned property. We have no direct records of Gaius's thoughts in that moment. Did the slayer see a person? Did he see a prize? Did he, a former slave, finally recognize himself as both the victim and the perpetrator of an oppressive system? We only know the stark, official fact recorded by the clerk processing the spoils. Then the act of true internal defiance occurred. Gaius performed a gesture that violated every expectation of Roman authority. He removed his ornate helmet, set his deadly sword aside, and sat heavily on the cold stone bench, burying his face in his hands. 5 minutes of absolute silence passed, an eternity measured in the frantic beat of Livia's heart. Finally, he spoke, using a rough dialect he'd picked up from various prisoners in the barracks. "What was his name?" Gaius asked. Livia, frozen, whispered, "Whose name? The man they made you watch die. Was it the warrior I killed today?" "No," she whispered. "A different one. 3 months ago." Gaius nodded, his head still bowed. "I killed a diabolus today. Maybe a brother, maybe a cousin. Your people have many with that name." What unfolded was not the expected, sanctioned assault, but a quiet, fragile conversation between 2 individuals the Empire had systematically tried to strip of their very humanity. Gaius confessed to the pain of his father's execution when he was a boy. Livia recounted the fire that consumed her village. 2 long hours passed. When the guards checked, they heard only talking, assumed compliance, and moved on. At 6 p.m., Gaius made a choice that carried the penalty of a whip or worse. He stood, walked to the door, and called the guard. "This woman," he announced, the lie transparent, "is sick, contaminated. I reject her. Take her to the physician." This was the single, narrow loophole. Rewards deemed diseased could be refused and returned to general prisoner status. The guard knew the lie was obvious, but the system's rules dictated that refusing a gladiator's prerogative was easier than investigating his moral motives. Livia was transferred to the medical holding area. The immediate consequence of Gaius's mercy was tragically ironic. Livia died anyway, 3 days later. not from the horror she was saved from, but from a swift, indifferent infection, a common end in the crowded, unsanitary confines of Roman captivity. The very act of compassion delivered her to a different form of death. Gaius never saw her again. He fought and won 2 more bouts that month, refusing the spoils both times. The empire held its breath. Whispers raced through the gladiatorial barracks. Maximus had gone soft, cursed, or converted to a strange, merciful Eastern cult. In truth, he had simply reclaimed his own humanity. And then the storm broke. On September 15, 79 AD, Senator Quintus Aurelius Semicus brought a formal complaint before the Senate. The issue was trivial. A junior gladiator had been beaten by his trainer for refusing a traditional reward, citing Maximus's example. But this small incident forced the Senate to publicly acknowledge the unspeakable practice of the Victoria Carnalis. We know from the preserved Senate records that a heated, 4-hour debate erupted over the propriety of certain practices related to defeated female captives. The conservative faction, led by Senator Fabius, argued for tradition. Our ancestors conquered their enemies utterly, body and soul. This made Rome great. But the reformers, backed by Stoic philosophy and raw pragmatism, countered with the chilling reality. We create martyrs and fuel resistance. Traumatized survivors return home with stories that ignite generations of hatred. The decisive factor wasn't morality. It was a political risk. 3 separate provincial governors had just reported a sharp increase in anti-Roman propaganda, specifically citing the empire's treatment of captive women as a rallying cry for rebellion. The practice was no longer profitable. It was actively hurting the empire. On October 1, 79 AD, the Senate passed the Lex Captivi, the law of captive women. Its provisions were limited but revolutionary. Female prisoners of war could no longer be used as rewards in public spectacles. Private exploitation continued, and the law didn't free a single person, but the state-sanctioned theater of humiliation was officially ended. 3 months later, Gaius Valerius Maximus was finally granted the rudis, his freedom, not for his merciful act, but for winning 5 consecutive fights. His final recorded action as a free man was purchasing and immediately freeing one Dacian woman from slavery. The records list her name simply as Camacicus. Whether she was the same woman who stood beside Livia in the arena remains unconfirmed, but is widely suspected. Gaius's single gesture of mercy saved one woman for days, but it could not dismantle the vast, profitable, blood-soaked system of exploitation. His act was a drop of humanity in an ocean of blood. Don't let the real, brutal history of Rome be forgotten. We need your support to continue unearthing these buried stories. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. Livia's final hours are an indelible stain. Dying of a mundane infection in a cramped, dark cell, she had survived the monstrous spectacle only to succumb to the brutal indifference of Roman bureaucracy. Her death was too routine to matter to the empire. Yet, the gladiator's single act of compassion became an inconvenient footnote in the Senate's official record. The real tragedy here isn't that Rome was cruel. Cruelty defined ancient warfare. The tragedy is that Rome perfected it, turning human agony into an efficient, state-run enterprise with established supply chains, dedicated architecture, and meticulous record-keeping. Fast forward 2 millennia to 2018. Beneath the Colosseum's eastern quadrant, archaeologists from the University of Rome, led by Dr. Isabella Fortunato, made a chilling discovery. Something you won't find on any tourist map. They excavated a hidden network of small, specialized rooms in the hypogeum. They weren't storage units or animal cages. These rooms had specific features. Iron rings set into the stone walls, precise drainage channels cut into the floors, and, most hauntingly, desperate scratch marks etched deep into the stone. The final, futile attempts of fingers seeking purchase, seeking escape, seeking proof they had existed. Carbon dating confirmed these chambers were original to the Colosseum's 80 AD construction, purpose-built, not later additions. The team found fragments of basic pottery, suggesting prolonged human occupation. But the most damning evidence? 6 bronze identification tags, stamped with the word captiva, captive woman, and dated between 79 and 82 AD. Dr. Fortunato's findings confirmed the whispers of the ancient chroniclers. Cassius Dio had explicitly described the allocation chambers for women prisoners. Seneca referenced the practice, though vaguely. Tacitus, so often graphic, was eerily silent, leading scholars to suspect the practice was so abhorrent even he censored it. This was no isolated incident. The specialized architecture and the tags prove it was systematized and routine. Why should a barbaric policy from the 1st century still matter to us today? It matters because this story exposes how every civilization, including ours, can justify atrocity through the deadly cocktail of law, tradition, and entertainment. Rome wasn't uniquely evil, but it was uniquely efficient at institutionalizing evil, making cruelty seem benign, and turning human screams into public applause. This tragedy teaches us that the distance between true civilization and barbarism is not measured in technology, roads, or stunning architecture. It is measured solely in how we treat the powerless. Rome built magnificent aqueducts that still stand, while simultaneously constructing dedicated chambers of shame beneath its entertainment venues. Engineering genius and moral bankruptcy coexisted in a seamless manner. It reveals how power distorts humanity on both sides. Gaius Valerius Maximus was simultaneously a victim, enslaved, forced to kill, and a perpetrator, granted absolute, terrifying power over someone even more helpless. The system didn't just create monsters. It corrupted decent people, twisting tradition into the ultimate justification for evil. Our ancestors did it was Rome's complete, conscience-killing answer to every moral question. Picture Livia's last conscious thought, dying of infection just meters beneath the world's greatest achievement of her era. Did she wonder if anyone would ever remember her name? History's darkest chapters prove that progress is not inevitable and that civilization is fragile. Every generation must choose between empathy and expedience. Rome chose spectacle. A gladiator's victory became a license for dehumanization. A routine reward system became Rome's most carefully buried scandal. And the story of Livia, Camacicus, and Gaius survives only because one man made a choice that achieved nothing except proving that humanity could flicker even in Rome's darkest corners. If this story left you shaken, history's uncomfortable truths matter more than comfortable myths. Subscribe now and hit that bell for the next hidden dark history on this channel. Tell us in the comments what unsettled you most: the systematic nature of the exploitation or Rome's efficiency at making atrocity routine.